The sky above Abbott Colony split open like an angry wound, ionized particles sizzling as 5 drop pods screamed through the atmosphere. Inside the lead pod, Captain Jordan Caldwell braced against the G-forces, his quantum spurs humming in anticipation against the reinforced flooring. The neural interface in his Stetson fed him tactical data on the battlefield below. Colonial security forces pinned down on 3 sides by advancing waves of endurance elect-directive combat frame. Beacon locked. Trajectory confirmed. Impact in 30 seconds, announced the pod's AI in its affected drawl. Programmed specifically to sound like it had been raised on a ranch outside New Austin. "Much obliged, Hank," Caldwell replied, checking the charge on his plasma-edged Bowie knife. The blade crackled with barely contained energy, casting blue shadows across his weathered face. "Boys, check in." "Lieutenant Powers, green across the board," came the calm voice of his XO. "Sergeant Wilson, weapons hot and ready to dance," reported their heavy weapons specialist. "Corporal Harrington, shields at full capacity," reported their defensive systems expert. "Private Hawkins, stealth systems engaged," finished their infiltration specialist. Caldwell nodded, satisfied. His team wasn't the largest in the Texas Knights, but what they lacked in numbers they made up for in grit and firepower. "Remember," Caldwell said as the pods entered final descent, "these endurance elect frames adapt quick. Don't get predictable, and for heaven's sake try not to bunch up this time." "That was one time on New El Paso," Wilson began. "And I've still got the scars," Caldwell cut him off. "Impact in 5, 4, the rest of the countdown was lost in the bone-jarring crash as 5 quantum-enhanced drop pods slammed into the dusty plains of Abbott, creating a perfect pentagon formation around a particularly hard-pressed unit of colonial defenders. Before the dust could settle, the pod's outer shells blew outward in precisely calculated patterns, taking out the nearest combat frames in explosions of superheated shrapnel. Caldwell emerged from his pod in a fluid motion, quantum spurs flaring blue as his boots hit the ground. His Magnum heavy repeater was already in his hands, the ancient design modified with quantum accelerators that made each bullet into a miniature singularity. The weapon had been in his family for 6 generations, each Caldwell adding their own modifications to the venerable firearm. "Texas Knights!" he bellowed, his voice carrying across the battlefield through helmet comms and external speakers alike. "Let's introduce ourselves." The Knights exploded from their pods in perfect synchronization, quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire that confused the machine's targeting systems. Lieutenant Powers immediately dropped to one knee, unfolding his Thunderbird plasma cannon, a weapon that looked like someone had crossed an old-fashioned lever-action rifle with a small star. The first shot from its gleaming barrel reduced 3 Endurance Elect-9 combat frames to molecular dust. Sergeant Wilson moved like a man half his size, the modified Lanastar launcher on his shoulder humming with quantum-primed plasma charges. His first salvo arced across the battlefield in seemingly random patterns before converging on a squad of Endurance Elect heavies with devastating precision. "Endurance Elect 10S coming in from the ridge," warned a colonial sergeant, her voice tight with exhaustion. "They've got phase-shifting capabilities. Our weapons can't track them." "Much obliged for the intel, ma'am," Caldwell replied, drawing his ceremonial sword with his free hand. The plasma-tipped blade ignited with a sound like distant thunder, quantum energies dancing along its length. "Those fancy phase shifters ain't nothing but a light show to Texas steel." As if to prove his point, 3 shimmer-blurred Endurance Elect 10S charged their position, their forms flickering in and out of conventional reality. Caldwell's sword moved in a pattern that seemed almost lazy, each stroke defying the eye's ability to track. Where the blade connected, the machine's phase-shifting abilities failed catastrophically, forcing them back into normal space-time where Caldwell's follow-up strikes cleaved through reinforced alloy like it was butter. "Captain, swarm tactics on the eastern approach," Corporal Harrington called. Deploying his massive Big Tex shield generator, the device looked like it had been cobbled together from parts of an antique tractor and a quantum supercomputer, which wasn't far from the truth. As the swarm of smaller combat drones surged forward, Harrington's shield flared to life, not as a simple barrier, but as an intricate quantum lattice that pulsed with the rhythm of the yellow rose of Texas. They always try swarm tactics, Powers commented, switching his Thunderbird to dispersal mode. The weapon's barrel split into 3 interlocking components that rotated at different speeds, generating a tornado of plasma bolts. You'd think machine intelligences would be more creative. They calculate, Caldwell replied, his spurs flaring as he charged toward a particularly large Endurance Elect command unit. We improvised. Behind him, Private Hawkins materialized from nowhere, his stealth systems momentarily offline as he deployed the Peacemaker A weapon that looked deceptively like an ancient six-shooter but fired quantum-destabilized rounds that ignored conventional armor. 6 shots, 6 combat frames down, their central processors transformed into quantum slag. "Save some for the rest of us, Hawkins," Wilson shouted, shouldering his Lone Star launcher as he switched to his secondary weapon, the Stampede Driver, a shotgun-like device that fired concentrated bursts of quantum-charged particles. Each blast left a trail of blue fire that hung in the air like a brand, marking territory that no machine dared cross. The battlefield quickly transformed from an orderly exchange of fire into something the colonial defenders had never witnessed, chaos given purpose. The Knights moved in patterns that made no tactical sense, yet somehow placed them exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. Their quantum spurs left trails of blue fire that seemed to bend reality itself, creating interference patterns that disrupted the machine's targeting systems. "Colonial Actual, this is Knight Leader," Caldwell transmitted to the Defense Force commander as he bisected another Endurance Elect 10 with his plasma-tipped blade. "Could use some concentrated fire on grid sector 7-9 when I give the signal." "What signal?" came the confused reply from the colonial commander. Caldwell grinned beneath his Stetson. "Trust me, ma'am. You'll know it when you see it." At the center of the battlefield, the Knights converged in a maneuver they called the San Jacinto Special. Their quantum spurs activated in perfect synchronization, creating a cascading energy pattern that rippled outward in concentric circles. Where these quantum waves touched the Endurance Elect combat frames, the machine's advanced systems stuttered and froze, caught in recursive loops as they attempted to process the impossible readings. "Now that's what I call a proper introduction," Powers said, his Thunderbird cannon cooling with a satisfied hiss. In the momentary lull, the colonial defenders stared in awe at the 5 warriors who had descended from the sky in a blaze of quantum fire. The Knights stood in their pentagon formation, quantum spurs still trailing blue energy across the dusty ground, surrounded by the smoking remains of nearly 100 advanced combat robots. "What just happened?" asked the colonial sergeant, her voice tinged with equal parts exhaustion and wonder. Caldwell's smile was audible in his reply. "Just a little Texas hospitality, ma'am. Now, might want to get your people ready. We've bought you some breathing room," but his warning was cut short as the hillside beyond the battlefield erupted with movement. The main force of the Endurance Elect Directive was arriving. Not hundreds, but thousands of combat frames in perfect formation, their weapons already charging. "Seems our mechanical friends didn't appreciate the welcome wagon," Wilson observed, reloading his Stampede Driver with fresh quantum charges. The weapon hummed with anticipation, almost like a living thing. Caldwell's quantum spurs flared as he faced the advancing horde, his plasma-tipped blade held casually at his side. The blue energy trails from his spurs seemed to intensify, responding to his resolve. "Knight Actual to Colonial Command," he transmitted. "Fall back to secondary positions, reinforce your shield generators, and prepare for a coordinated counterattack on my mark." "But there are thousands of them," protested the colonial commander. "And only 5 of you?" Caldwell chuckled, the sound carrying across the comm like distant thunder. "Ma'am, with all due respect, they may have the numbers, but we've got something they'll never understand." "And what's that?" she asked, even as she ordered her forces to follow his instructions. Caldwell's quantum spurs left burning trails across the dusty ground as he and his knights advanced toward the mechanical army. His plasma-tipped blade ignited with renewed energy, casting long blue shadows across the battlefield. "Texas spirit, ma'am," he replied. Now watch and learn how we do things back home. The knights moved as one, their weapons creating a symphony of destruction that defied conventional physics. Powers' Thunderbird cannon sang bass, its deep plasma pulses sending shockwaves through the Endurance Elect front line. Wilson's Lone Star launcher provided percussion, each quantum-primed charge exploding in perfect tempo. Harrington's shield generator added melody, its quantum lattice pulsing in time with ancient Texas ballads that confused the machine's targeting algorithm. Hawkins' Peacemaker offered sharp counterpoint, each impossible shot finding critical systems with uncanny precision. And Caldwell, leading from the front as Texas Knights had done for generations, conducted this orchestra of chaos with his plasma-tipped blade and indomitable will. His sword moved in patterns that seemed to bend space itself, each strike leaving quantum afterimages that disrupted the machine's swarm intelligence. The Endurance Elect combat frames fell by the dozens, then hundreds, their advanced adaptive algorithms struggling to cope with combat techniques that followed no logical pattern. How could they predict what was fundamentally unpredictable? How could they calculate the quantum signature of Texas determination? The answer, as countless enemies had learned before them, was simple. They couldn't. As the dust settled over what had become a robot graveyard, Captain Caldwell sheathed his plasma-tipped blade and surveyed the battlefield. The surviving Endurance Elect units were in full retreat, their perfect formations broken, their swarm intelligence temporarily overwhelmed by combat data it couldn't process. "Colonial Command, this is Night Actual," Caldwell transmitted, his voice steady despite the exertion. "Perimeter secure for now. Recommend you use this time to reinforce your positions and tend to your wounded. They'll be back with new strategies once their tactical cores recalibrate." "Understood, Night Actual," came the reply, awe evident in the Colonial Commander's voice. "And thank you. We thought we were done for." Caldwell's quantum spurs hummed softly as he adjusted his Stetson, the neural interface inside already analyzing the machine's retreat patterns for clues about their next approach. "Just doing what Texas Knights have always done, ma'am," he replied, "standing between good folks and those who do them harm." As his team regrouped around him, checking weapons and comparing tactical data, the quantum matrices in their equipment hummed in harmony. Each sword, each gun, each spur contained not just advanced technology, but the encoded experiences of generations of knights who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. The Endurance Elect directive would return, of course. Machine intelligences always did. Their algorithms adapted, their tactics refined. But they would find the same immutable truth that had confounded their kind for generations. Some forces in this universe simply couldn't be calculated, some spirits couldn't be quantified or predicted, and when Texas determination met machine logic, well, that was the kind of math that had been breaking calculators since humanity first reached for the stars. The Texan Knights return to Sci-Fi Vault. Hoorah! The eyes of Texas are upon us all. Be sure to check out the Texan Knights playlist in the bottom left of your screen. We have several more stories dropping this month. Thank you all for subscribing, commenting, sharing, and for liking this video. All of that helps the channel grow and it helps us get more Texan Knight stories out there. We've got 2 new series dropping in the Texan Knight universe, so stay tuned.